Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Mouthful of History. Before we get started, I just have to say, I thought I had the best last day on the job story until very recently because my last day working at Big Five Sporting Goods was pretty fun. Last day, I know I'm going to another job, so everything is kind of consequence free for the day. We were doing the sidewalk sale out in front of our store, and we were packing up because the sidewalk sale ended at 4 o'clock or whatever, while the store closed at 6 on that day. And all of our brochures, everything advertising the sidewalk sale that we were doing, very clearly indicated that the sidewalk sale would end before the store actually closed. So we're actually packing up a little bit after the stated shutdown time of our sidewalk sale. But this lady comes up and she asks that we stop doing that and that we unpack everything that we had been packing up so that she could look at her stuff. So I very nicely explained to her that this is already past the time we were supposed to, go to, and that, we need to get everything situated so we could go back inside because, we didn't have enough people to not be inside the where we were supposed to be. So she gets very upset and she tries to say that the brochure said we were actually doing it until 6, and she just starts going off on us. But again, this was my last day. So she gets mad. She starts talking about everything, having supposedly saying that it would be open until 6 and everything. And then she gets this really condescending, venomous look on her face, looks me in the eyes, and says, "I'm just very disappointed in all of you." And so I just look at her and I'm like, "You know what, lady? I'm disappointed in you." And she got
That was
so
the
mad.
antidote to the Karen.
Yeah, exactly. And she got so mad. But I told her it was my last day, and so there was nothing she could do about it. Any of you who are listening right now who've ever worked any sort of service job, probably just orgasmed, I would guess, because we've all been there. We've all had that really terrible customer. But as proud as I am of that story, I think Nick actually has me beat from his last day of work at Amazon. So, Nick, take it away.
Okay, so if you remember our last episode, I told you that I contracted COVID. I contracted COVID working at an Amazon fulfillment center. I came back, and the worst part about all of it was that now they were telling me that they were upset with I couldn't fulfill the number of picks that they want. I'm not moving as fast. Mind you, this is just a few weeks after recovering from COVID. I'm now suffering from just crazy like fatigue and reduced lung capacity, and so I got disillusioned, so I started looking for a new job. I'm also getting in the process of moving, so I'm trying to find a job closer to where I'm going to be living. So I went on an interview on one of my days off, came back, didn't think much of it. On the day, a few Sundays ago, I get a call in the middle of a pick. I was supposed to be picking groceries for somebody, and I take the call real quick. I step outside. They're like, "Hey, we want to know if you'd come in and do your can do your paperwork." I'm like, "Are you telling me I got the job?" Like, "You got the job." So I'm not going to tell you where I work because I don't want to get sued if they think this is in bad taste.
And we don't want our stalkerish fans to, to find Nick.
To trace his footsteps.
So I go back to my cart, I push it to the side, I put my scanner down, and I walk out of the building, get in my car, and drive all the way to my new job.
He just dipped.
I just left. I didn't say a thing. I didn't say bye. Nothing. I just left.
Just dropped the mic and left. Well, you didn't drop the mic, but you just like, all right, peace. you're fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. It was like
Yeah.
half baked. Like
Yeah, fuck you, fuck you. You're cool. Fuck you, I'm out.
Yeah, so that was the end of Nick at Amazon. I will never go back. I'm so happy to be gone. And while my current job is it can be get busy and it is tiring, at least they didn't fucking give me COVID. I can't wait, of course, until probably one of the current administration or the next administration makes it impossible to sue companies for giving their workers COVID. I will be first in line to sue these motherfuckers.
And I'm gonna be there with a flag and a number one pointy finger cheering you on.
So
is a base take.
the point here is that it wasn't about the money, although I did get a slight bump in pay. It was about the fact that I no longer felt safe working for a company that didn't take my health seriously in the first place.
Yeah, and just like at basically every warehouse does not take the health of their employees seriously at all.
So before we get into any episode, should we talk about any other news? How about the future plot of The Big Short Part 2?
You know, I love the first one, and so I'm looking forward to the second one that's going to be made about this current moment.
Like seriously, why in the absolute like God on earth they make a movie about a short investor this dude who should not even have airtime has now gotten airtime.
Hey, fuck you. The Big Short's awesome.
Yeah, The Big Short's a really good movie, Cameron. You got to check it out.
It's a really good movie about a really crappy thing, dog.
Yeah,
but it shows that it's crappy.
Yeah.
The movie doesn't make our protagonists into be heroes. They're assholes for shorting the market, but the fact that there was a market to short shows how bad the system is.
Well, this
Which
guy.
I just gotta say, by the way, hints of that are already in The Other Guys, which is a comedy made by the same guy who made The Big Short. I recently rewatched The Big Guys maybe about a month or two ago, and that movie really holds up, both because of the humor and because the whole message is basically just shitting on Wall Street.
But Cameron does have a message for people who do want to think that you can stop capitalism with more capitalism.
It's like saying you can stop racism with racism.
Yeah, and folks, we here at this podcast are proud endorsers of Fred Hampton and, fighting bad stuff with good stuff, like he talked about fighting racism with solidarity.
It's just like, it's always nice to see a hedge fund go down, but Wall Street's a hydra. One hedge fund goes down, another hedge fund takes its place. Like, yeah, it's a momentary W. It's a momentary win, but we need to stop overstating it because, not everyone who put money in GME stock, has the same like goals in mind.
Yeah, a lot of them are mad, not that Wall Street is a den of bullshit and thievery and exploitation. They're mad that they're the ones who aren't extremely rich. And so, definitely celebrate the dub. Definitely, enjoy the spooks at Wall Street being uncomfortable and squirming around. I know I'm enjoying it quite a bit, but, just don't think that this is necessarily Occupy Part 2 or something like that.
I mean, the Wall Street Bets chairman said that we're not socialists, as he speaks for every single one who put stock in.
Exactly, yeah. They've said, a lot of the people leading the charge have said that they just want a free market, which, if you don't have anything holding back the mega wealthy like you do in a free market, they're going to coalesce behind a lot of really powerful rich people, which is essentially what we have now. So if you want a free market, like, this is it. This is that. You have what you say you want, but this is what that actually looks like.
We need a maximum wage.
Yeah, no, why not, right?
I mean, speaking of free markets, post World War II, there were a lot of markets that were open, but some people don't like open markets. which is
Yeah,
a
we're
good
gonna
thing. Which is a good thing. Which they need. Which no one wants to exploit anybody.
Yeah.
So we had a few countries that decided to close those markets and use the revenue for themselves.
And if you want to know more about that, come back to us after the theme song.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Or we're just gonna die like patriots.
There's no bigger middle finger than, hey, you want to put me in suicide missions? Okay, I'm just going to keep living. He clearly figured out how to go Super Saiyan.
He wanted Schmeling dead, but he just wouldn't die.
He was anti-bank, anti-paper money, and he's on the $20 bill.
Nego just comes out of nowhere, soars across the sky.
Welcome back to A Mouthful of History, everybody. I am, as always, your host, Nicholas Malott. Joined with me, David.
Hey everyone, good to be here.
And Cameron.
Hello, hi.
And she is not going to be talking, but joining us on this Zoom call is editor and producer Caroline. All right. As we said on the season premiere, we're going to be talking about Iran, specifically the coup of Iran, which post-World War II, there was a lot of decolonization, but also a lot of the U.S. flexing its imperial muscle, theoretically, to stop the spread of communism, but quite honestly, just to establish their new position as a hegemonic power over countries that previously ruled by European empires. Iran is such case. Now, Iran is weird because Iran wasn't ran by the British per se, but a big part of Iran was the oil. It's a big oil-producing country, and one country, actually not the U.S., the British, controlled the oil in Iran. So I'm going to pass it over to David, who's going to give us a little bit of context.
So before we even talk about the 20th century, just to kind of lay the groundwork for Iran as not even just a country, but as an area, because it's been coherent culture before it formally became a nation state. Iran or Persia, also even going further back, has had a lot of dynasties and civilizations in that area throughout the millennia, even going back to ancient times. And so when Islam formed, oh, Cameron, something to say?
Well, I mean, we saw the beginnings of centralized bureaucracy in the world in Persia. The Greeks copied it, then the Romans took a little bit of that. And then the Arabs, when they conquered Persia, the Sassanid Empire, they still kept the structures in.
So when the Middle East started becoming Islamicized, when Islam was spreading, that's exactly right. Basically, Persian culture and customs became the model in which the Islamic empires were run, because the Arabs were good at a number of things, but really Persia was where administration and the running of these large scale societies, it's where they really shined.
Yeah, and of course, the influence of Persia. I mean, most people understanding of Persia probably ends with something like 300. That's the bad guys.
Yeah, true.
But the importance of that really stems from the fact that Persia, by that point, was the dominant empire in the world. That was the height of high culture.
Then Alexander wrecked them.
Yeah, although it's kind of interesting, even after that, Persia was still considered in a lot of places in the Mediterranean a sort of high culture. So, in the same way in the modern day, Paris isn't necessarily the biggest city in the world, but you're French and specifically Parisian, you're considered very cultured. And so it was kind of the same way back then with Persia.
Well, the Eastern Mediterranean had all the people, had all the wealth, and good land.
Yeah. Fun fact also, side note, even though the Greek city-states united together to fight Persia in the Persian War, in the Peloponnesian War, it was actually through the help of the Persians that the Spartans were able to actually get ahead on the...
Yeah, that's right, because Athens had just become its own bully for the region.
Yeah.
But anyway, with all that said, just a final note before we get to Iran, in the 20th century, it just so happens that I work for a world history program Basically, it's technically not world history, but it basically is. And one thing that we're talking about in the class that I think is just an idea worth putting into everyone's minds to chew on is that a lot of class and social issues in the Middle East since the advent of Islam, they're often disguised as religious issues and movements and branches from the mainstream of Islam. But a lot of the time, again, like they have these underlying social and class issues. And so when you read about different movements that come about within Islam in the Middle East throughout the ages, a lot of the time it is hiding a sort of discontent with the status quo expressed through a religious language because that's the dominant kind of social infrastructure there, but has a lot of like, again, social, class, political concerns underneath.
Especially when they talk about terrorism, you know?
Yeah, and let's be honest here.
Even if we want to get into
Sectarian violence in Islam, it doesn't hold a candle to the sectarian violence created from the Protestant Catholic split.
Absolutely not. Bush League. Bush League by comparison.
Get those numbers up, rookies.
Come on, you black and tans.
just the word.
Unite the counties.
Nothing that Islam has done. And yeah, there are atrocities that you could attribute to Islam, of course, as there is with any religion. Nothing, I still think nothing comes close to things like the Crusades, where they just basically went and destroyed Muslim communities because.
Yeah, and I think also, even when it's
or the
when it's
Reconquista.
Christianity, when it's Islam, when it's whatever religion, my view of it is that there's always political machinations underneath. And I mean, that's why, like, for example, the Crusaders from Western Europe, they sacked Constantinople. They sacked the Byzantine Empire that they said they were going to help. So,
And basically,
it's not clearly about being the best Christian.
Yeah, it basically made it soft and set up the Turkish conquest.
Exactly.
I mean, it's just like if you don't look at these events with a material analysis, then you're just like,
yeah, you're just going to think it's that different cultures can't coexist, which is nonsense. Different cultures have always coexisted unless there are conditions of crisis or greed or trying to seize power that through those political problems look like a cultural problem from the outside. So, we're not even at the Iran in the 20th century, but before that, just like, if you take away anything from this, always whenever there's a conflict, look at the underlying economic, political, social machinations that get dressed up as a conflict between cultures.
Final point on the Crusades is like the first crusade was the Prince's Crusade. These are princes who never were going to be kings, so they wanted to establish kingdoms in the Middle East. That was their material reality. They wanted to carve out something for themselves. But the thing is, yeah, it's just when you don't look at things through a material lens, then you often quite scratch your head.
Be on the lookout for maybe future Mouthful of History on the Crusades.
Yeah, it seems like we have stuff to say on this, which I didn't even think about ahead of time.
All right, so that's kind of a good setup for
Iran, or Persia as it's mostly known.
Through most of its history anyway, so it's Persia. So into the 20th century,
there were a lot of attempts to control Iran.
England tried to make it a protectorate like it did with
every country it had business with in the Middle East.
Palestine comes to mind.
The English never saw a country they didn't want to settle in.
Nope.
They just cannot keep their hands to themselves, man. Just their limey little hands.
They fucking started a war with Argentina.
Because they wouldn't give shit back.
Yeah, they still, to this day, argue about the Falkland Islands.
The Falkland Islands. The only thing there are sheep.
Of what use are the Falkland Islands to anybody unless you're a fucking herder?
The fucking islands, man. The fucking islands.
And other than that, you have the Ottomans, who, of course, were
the dominant power in that
part of the world. There was Russia. And this all stems from the fact that in the early 20th... Well,
prior, but really in the early 20th century...
There's petroleum wells found in Iran, and petroleum becomes a major resource.
Nothing's changed, of course.
Yeah, it's still very similar a century later.
Eventually, Russia and England would divide
Iran into spheres of influence, north and south, doesn't matter who has what. The point is, of course, is that Iran does not have any say-so over its major resource.
Yeah, when they had these conferences, Iran wasn't even at the table, really.
Russia would relinquish its control in after the Russian Revolution, given the instability of Russia, but also once the Bolsheviks come to power, Lenin's distaste for imperialism.
Spoiler alert, when Stalin comes to power in the Soviet Union, it would not quite be the same thing.
Yeah, A Mouthful of History takes a very leftist stance on everything. We are four very big leftists. We are not tankies. Sorry,
Yeah.
tankies.
And if you don't know what that means, don't look it up. Your life is better to not know what the term means.
But if you are curious, Urban Dictionary has every word you can look up. So
Yeah, this is a tank-free zone, except for the tanking the Cubs are going to be doing next year.
Yeah, although, I also do feel
oh no. You're not blasting that. You're not getting away with that, dude. The NL Central sucks. We can still win it.
Anyway, back on topic.
Wow, dude. Wow, man.
I do feel like, though, if you take, among some people, if you take side of any leftist leader, they'll call you a tank.
So, generally speaking, though, the Ottomans still had some influence over Iran. Iranian populations were actually parts of the people who would be victimized in both the Armenian and the Assyrian genocides. The Assyrian genocide, a genocide that does not get brought up nearly enough.
I actually did not know that they were dragged into the Armenian genocide.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really, the Assyrian part is part of the Armenian genocide. There was, of course, the recognized leader of Iran was called the Shah. Basically, it's just a Persian way of saying king or emperor or whatever.
Well, Shah always been the term for the king in Persia, like Shahanshah. Yeah. Like Shahvaraz, and it's been in use since ancient times.
So yeah, at the time of the early 20th century, it's I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing this, the Qajar dynasty.
Khazars.
Yeah. They're overthrown in 1921 by Reza Khan, who stages a coup. And by 1925, he would rule as Reza Shah Pahlavi, which basically creates the Pahlavi dynasty. The Pahlavis aren't yet, as we know them, the dictatorial leaders of Iran. It's a constitutional monarchy with essentially a unilateral body, Congress or parliament. And
so they were the single parliamentary house. They were called the Majlis, and so they were established in 1906. And so from 1906 to 1911, they actually had pretty good authority, but after 1911, the Shah did reclaim a lot of his power through some brute force, we shall say.
Yeah, eventually he gives way to his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who will go down in history as just being called the Shah. He's just known as the Shah.
Side note, when I was reading the book about this, I was picturing the Shah Jr. as that, prince from Legend of Korra. The, incompetent young prince who just has no idea what the fuck he's doing. That was who I had in my head just the entire time I was reading that.
I mean, I don't even know what you're talking about, so I'm just going to roll with it.
It should be noted, part of the reason why he came into power is his father had basically forced to abdicate by the British because the first member of the Pahlavi dynasty was a Nazi sympathizer.
Yeah, a pretty heavy one.
Yeah, he was sympathetic to the Nazis, and the British were afraid that they were going to lose their petroleum wells to the Nazis, and there were inroads made by the Nazi party.
Yeah, it was not an unfounded fear.
No.
Shah Hitler.
Basically.
That's nuts, man. That is nuts.
At the very least, if he moved closer to Persia, they'd be closer to historical Aryans.
Right.
Yeah, I heard Hitler loved the Pakistanis.
So his son takes over. History will know him as a Shah. Now, he actually is a reformist at first. However, his reformist tendencies would come into conflict by what we can basically say is the main character of this episode, the new prime minister elected in 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh.
Right. And before we get to him, just to talk briefly about kind of the force of popular consciousness, I guess you could say, that was emerging in Iran. So there are two groups to talk about real quick. One is Tudeh, which means the masses, which is basically Iran's Communist Party, founded in 1944. So you hear communist, probably think of the Soviet Union. And in this case, there was a mixture of, just very like idealistic people who are dedicated to Iranian liberation and everything, and then people that are just very pro Soviet, and also people who are kind of in between, right? But Iran's Communist Party, again, is kind of a mixture of pro Soviet forces and kind of more organic liberation Iranian folks.
But we can generally say it was like a hodgepodge of leftism.
Exactly, yeah. Different strands of leftism.
Think the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks from our Russian episode.
It's composed of young people, workers, academics, activists, organizers, the kind of normal demographics you see in a leftist party. And they did a lot of good too, thanks to a lot of really hardcore like organizing campaigns in 1946. They passed a lot of big reforms. They got child labor limited dramatically from what it was before, because there basically like were no child labor laws until this 1946 campaign. They got a 48-hour work week, guaranteed maternity leave for women, and a minimum wage. So pretty cool stuff. But they do get kind of, one, suppressed by the Shah, and then two, they do get taken over a little bit more after this by the pro-Soviet, pro-Stalinist faction. And so they're kind of more concerned about like trying to strengthen the North, and some of them trying to like get stronger ties to like Stalin's Soviet Union and stuff. And so they lose a little bit of their luster. Although again, there's still plenty of pro-liberation lefties in Tudeh. But the sort of main strain of Iranian liberation comes then with the National Front. And so the National Front is founded in 1949, and it is a coalition of all sorts of forces of Iranian society. And so you have political parties.
I'm sorry, I was going to just add, if you have any knowledge of parliamentary politics, you know that for the most part, getting a major majority from a single party is difficult. So you'll generally run into things like coalition governments, like the National Front.
Exactly, right? And so in this one, in the National Front, you have a coalition of political parties, including the Tudeh, trade unions, religious figures, civic groups, and all sorts of just different organizations that are focused on helping Iran basically be controlled by Iran. And of course, again, they're not formally colonized, but they are being exploited in a lot of ways. And so ideologically, you have parliamentarians, you have secularists, Islamists, socialists, communists, mercantilists, just a whole rainbow of different ideologies.
All the ist are here.
Yeah, basically.
Succinctly put, all the ists.
All the ists, all the isms.
Every ism you could think of is in this spot right now.
Yeah, exactly. But what united them was a belief in Iranian self-determination and some form of democracy.
Iran for Iran, Iranian oil for Iranians.
Exactly. And having the modules and having, again, some form of democracy, what exactly that would look like, different members had different ideas of, but some form of popular determination. And, of course, when they were founded, they elected Mohammad Mossadegh as their leader.
Mohammad Mossadegh,
should be noted up front,
considered himself a nationalist. He hardcore believed in Iranian independence,
and that the British had no right,
he was right, of course, to exploit Iran for their oil.
If they wanted Iranian oil, they had to pay for it, but that money was going to go to the Iranian people.
Damn right.
Now, he does enlist some reforms, given his major popularity. He's afforded a lot, actually. Go ahead, David. Give up some reforms.
So, under the National Front-led government, again with Mossadegh as the prime minister, they get unemployment compensation, workers' compensation for injury, an end to forced labor for peasants in the countryside, and further entrenchment of democracy, making sure that elections are fair, and also expanded freedom of the press and freedom of speech. This was, by a wide margin, like it's not even close, the most free period in modern Iranian history.
Just inject democracy in my veins.
Like real democracy, not that American-styled, we're bringing democracy to Venezuela. By the way, we're appointing your leader and we're telling him exactly what to say.
Well, didn't Stephen
Yeah,
well,
exactly.
didn't Stephen Kinzer talk about that too?
Probably.
Stephen Kinzer talking about what the notion of U.S. democracy was. I know David harped on it on Twitter.
Give me this kind of democracy right here. Just that actual democracy where the people of the country actually get to enjoy it and like get the fruits of their labor.
Yeah, exactly. Not just voting for leaders, but also getting, like you said, the fruits of your labor and having a social safety net and sense of community within your country.
Yeah. The company that was running the oil in Iran as basically an arm of the British government is the Anglo-Iranian
Oil company.
AIOC.
And so, under the agreements at this time with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Iran only received 16% of the profits generated by the oil that the AIOC got from Iran.
16 fucking
Percent. That's right. 16%.
Iran, the place where the oil is being found,
They got 16%, while those British fuckers
get everything else.
And just for comparison's sake, around the time when Mossadegh does come to power, the US had actually just signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia under the Truman administration that split the profits between the US and Saudi Arabia 50-50. And Iran, again, 16%. 16.
I mean, what's not to love about Saudi Arabia?
Well,
Am I right?
that is a different episode.
Yeah, the real, if you wanted to look at it like a real bad guy in the Middle East, it's not Iran, it's fucking Saudi Arabia with the support of the US government.
Oh, full-hearted support, yeah.
Yeah.
But anyways,
ask a Yemeni how they feel about Saudi Arabia.
yeah, exactly. But anyways, not only do you have this deeply unjust system of profits and profit splitting, but also just the workers themselves that were working for the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They lived in horrendous shanty towns, and they were formally banned, basically segregated, from all the amenities like the movie theaters, the dance halls, the bars, all those sorts of places that the British had set up for themselves near the oil rigs. So they were paid scraps, or really even scraps of scraps. They were paid almost nothing. And they were not allowed to participate in anything that the British had set up near the company property.
And then also, like, I was looking through a few things on the internet, and I ran upon a speech about that Mossadegh had, and he talked about what Iran would do with the newfound revenue from nationalization, and it goes as such. Our long years of negotiation with foreign countries have yielded no results thus far. With the oil revenues, we can meet our entire budget and combat poverty, disease, and backwardness among our people. Another important consideration is that by the elimination of the power of the British company, we would also eliminate corruption and intrigue by means of which the internal affairs of our country have been influenced. Once this tutelage has ceased, Iran will have achieved its economic and political independence. The Iranian state prefers to take over the production of petroleum itself. The company should do nothing else but return its property to its rightful owners. The nationalization law provides 25% of the net profits on oil be set aside to meet all the legitimate claims of the company for compensation. It has been asserted abroad that Iran intends to expel the foreign oil exports from the country and then shut down oil installations. Not only is this allegation absurd, it is utter invention.
So fuck you.
Fuck the British, baby. And
if you want to buy Iranian oil, you must buy it from us.
And I should have written down a quote, because the way the British saw the Iranians it wasn't even the shocking, like, early 20th century racism that you see in a lot of places. It was 19th century racism. It was really disgusting.
Yes.
Are we talking like Rudyard Kipling, like White Man's Burden-esque?
Basically, I mean, it was really like, the Iranian subject is predisposed toward lying and weakness. I mean, just the scummiest shit.
Conveniently forgetting that Persia was like at once one of the cradles of civilization.
Yeah, we don't have enough time to talk about the amount of whining the British were doing at this time. Probably because they were watching the French get their asses kicked in Southeast Asia and thinking, oh God, it's going to happen to us now too.
Yeah, we're next. Yeah,
It's
and so
happened
going
again.
back to nationalization, Mossadegh and the National Front didn't just see the nationalization of the oil industry as symbolically important, but also materially important because, like we've talked about, Iranians were being cheated of the fruits of their labor and also of their natural resources within their land. And so this was a way to combat that and also really be able to generate their own wealth, again, from their own labor and resources.
Now, nationalization of the oil made Mossadegh essentially a hero in Iran.
The people,
Loved him because of this.
and of course, it made him public enemy number one amongst the British. Because again, the British haven't met
A
revolutionary type leader that they can't wait to get rid of.
And he also passed the Land Reform Act as well, which forced landlords to turn over 20% of their revenues to their tenants.
Yep. Basically, whenever the British hate you, you're doing something extremely well and something extremely just good for the world.
This led, of course, to harsh embargoes on Iran because, again, the British are babies. As we've already said, they're the classic racist. Man, the minute some brown people start asserting some authority over them, gosh, they just turn into the
Biggest whiny babies.
They turned into a bunch of Tommy Robinsons.
Basically. Yeah, and on top of that, what's extra funny here, but also I think telling, is just to clarify for our listeners at home, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was not owned by the British state. It is a private, or was a private company, but because it had its tendrils deep in the British system, they are, of course, reflecting the interests of capital. So this is not even necessarily a national project for the British state itself to be getting oil revenues from Iran, but it is just them helping out their buddies in a private corporation to benefit all of them, all the people that are associated with it.
So, of course, we already mentioned the embargo, which, side note, Mossadegh's actions made him a major celebrity-like figure to anti-colonialists in Asia and Africa.
Who were watching this and going, oh, wait, you can actually do that?
Yeah, he was one of the first big anti-colonial figures next to people ranging from Gandhi to Ho Chi Minh. These were some of the OG post World War II anti-colonists before you see even more of it in the 60s and even the 70s.
I mean, even at this time too, you saw Algeria start to rack up the sentiment as well.
Nice. So England, of course, did their embargoes. They planned an armed insurrection
against Iran, but of course,
England, still reeling from World War II, didn't really have the military force to go about this. So they actually tried to rope the U.S. into it. However, President at the time, Harry Truman,
had no real interest in
armed conflict with Iran. However,
yeah, President Truman was, for all of his faults, definitely at least sympathetic to the liberation movements around the world against European colonization. Of course, he was more neutral than supportive of them, but he was at least sympathetic.
Yeah. However, there was an election not too long after England started planning this coup, and
Harry Truman,
with his waning popularity,
does find a willing partner in Eisenhower. Now,
David is going to give you a quick introduction of the Dulles brothers, who I think this is the first time we're mentioning them on this podcast.
Oh boy. Someone hold my hoops, because damn, I fucking hate the Dulles brothers. Literally two of the worst people that have ever exercised and held power in U.S. history. I mean, just two of the fucking biggest demons that we've ever produced, and that's saying a lot.
Tell us about the Dulles brothers. Oh, wait, sorry, Cameron is telling us that we did in fact mention them in our Vietnam episode. Shout out to Cameron for remembering that.
Okay, cool. All right, so the Dulles brothers, baby, let's go. John Foster Dulles was born 1888, and Allen Dulles was born 1893. So they actually come from a long line of people who have worked in the State Department, in diplomacy in the U.S. Their grandfather, John Foster, was Secretary of State under Benjamin Harrison, everyone's favorite and most remembered president. And their uncle, Robert Lansing, was Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. His second Secretary of State, I believe, because I think the first one was William Jennings Bryan.
Yeah, who resigned in protest to joining World War One.
Which, I mean, makes sense because World War One, possibly the most senseless war of all time, which is really saying a lot. But with the Dulles brothers, both of them were just rabidly anti-communist and also just incapable of seeing people in the global south as, trying to fight for their own self-determination, as adopting Marxist principles but melding them into a sort of local liberation sort of style of Marxism that was really for, again, their freedom and their solidarity with other colonized folks and oppressed folks. So the Dulles brothers, completely incapable of seeing any of this, and just saw everything through the lens of the Cold War.
Remember, everybody, never forget, when you give somebody a hammer, everything's a nail.
Yep. And they were just fully just immersed in that ideology. Now, under Eisenhower, the stern, dull, I'm just going to say it, charismaless lump, John Foster Dulles, became the Secretary of State.
Honestly, the job in the government for dull, uncharismatic people.
Whoa, hold on, buddy. I think you're forgetting John Kerry was Secretary of State.
Yeah, ball of charisma, John Kerry.
Yeah, so I bet you're feeling pretty silly for having said that now, being reminded that John Kerry was Secretary of State.
I'm for the war, but I'm kind of against it.
Look, with the most exciting Secretary of State of all time is Thomas Jefferson. That gives you an idea.
Thomas Jefferson has always been considered a dull person in his personal life. So, yeah, no. Sorry. The Secretary of State is where boring career diplomats, that's what they strive to be, Secretary of State.
The real money's to be made running one of our, basically the shadow government part.
That deep state.
So speaking of shadow government and the deep state, that is where his brother Allen Dulles was placed. He became the head of the CIA. So because you have these two brothers who, have a pretty close bond, but also share the same ideology, the two departments were really well synchronized and they worked almost as if they were one. And so they were able to coordinate things in a way that no one has really been able to coordinate since, or before, for that matter. So these brothers decided that Mossadegh had to go, and even before they got the okay from Eisenhower, they were already consulting with the British to set plans for the coup in motion. And, fun fact, Eisenhower was kind of like Truman and didn't even really support the coup at first. He had to be convinced and kind of arguably, if not lied to, at least had the threat of communism and the Soviet takeover of Iran exaggerated to him for him to sign on to the coup.
Also, as I was reading about it, they really had to convince the Shah to do it as well. But he was so hesitant because, well, if Mossadegh's gone and I'm still here, I'm the bad guy.
Yeah.
As much as the Shah and
Mossadegh did not like each other,
the Shah
could not argue against Mossadegh's
popularity.
But then he got money.
Yeah, but it should also be said that the Shah was just fundamentally like a cowardly person. He did not have his father's iron fist.
But the thing is, though, the CIA gave his wife a mink coat.
Oh,
That
yeah, they
changed-
gave him a lot more than that.
Like, that tipped the scale for him. It was like, they're giving my wife some bling. All right, I'm down. I'm down.
That's easy. For anybody who here knows, if you want something done right,
all you need to do, especially if you think the person talking to you
can't be argued with, just fucking convince their wife, because the wife will get the job done.
Yeah, especially when you have someone with the personality of the Shah. Who, and it should be said real quick too, it's not that he didn't want to undo what Mossadegh did, but I mean, not only was Mossadegh popular, but everything that he and the National Front had done were immensely popular. And of course, that is why Mossadegh was popular, because of all these policies. So to publicly be against the nationalization of the oil industry of Iran, as well as some of the other stuff they had done, it would just be political suicide. You couldn't openly oppose it. And actually, people from the Majlis who were paid off by the British, who tried to come out against it, they got murked electorally. It was just not a good idea.
And then the CIA, in the declassified documents that came out a few years ago, they were sending informants disguised as people in the National Front, like socialists or communists, and they'd go around to like if you spoke badly against Mossadegh, they would threaten harm.
Oh yeah, no, everything. So there was the coup itself, which we'll get into just a second, but there was also a lead up to the coup. So just like Cameron said, they're paying these mobs of people to start violence, to seem like, just rowdy pro Mossadegh supporters. And they're also paying mobs of people to cheer on the Shah to make it look like Mossadegh was losing popularity. They paid off newspapers to print anti-Mossadegh pro-Shah things.
They also had voting booths about like the popularity of the Shah, and some were purposely yes. Like that was the only thing that was in the booth.
Yeah, you could only mark yes.
Then you'd have things like when the Iranians would try to control, like, work on their own oil refineries, British ordering that members of the
AIOC cannot
help them. So it would actually cause an oil crisis because now these untrained.
Iranian oil workers can't meet the demand.
Yeah, and even when other countries tried to send in their own ships to help the people of Iran, the British set up a blockade and they actually turned back an Italian ship that was trying to come in despite the blockade. So they were really the strangling on both Iran as a whole and also specifically their oil industry. And so another thing that happened in the streets was they paid off local religious leaders, military officials, and other civic figures to again rally behind the Shah, reject Mossadegh. So they're creating this intense polarization, and again, not only trying to make it look like the Shah was more popular than he was, but also trying to make it seem like a lot of Mossadegh supporters were violent and rowdy and against some of the freedoms that Mossadegh had literally helped bring to the country.
I think one of the main things also is that they wanted to create an appeal to the entire world.
Yeah, they wanted to say Mossadegh was a bad leader because of all the instability that they had caused with all their superior, resources and wealth and connections.
Like you see the rigged polls, you see all the paid anti-sentiment. They wanted to show the world like this was considered a quote unquote just cause.
Yeah, so we're going to get into the coup portion of this, but before I start, I just want to say it takes years for us to find out how all this stuff actually played out, and you always have to be weary and
know who the sources are coming from when it comes to
these things, because the British embargo was hugely successful, and it created an economic crunch in Iran, and that helped play into the declining popularity of Mossadegh, who still had support among the working class, but now was losing the clerical support. And yeah, economic downturn does turn the working class against you.
Okay, so the thing is, there was a first coup attempt that failed.
Yeah, that had to do with the attempted assassination of the Shah.
Yeah, there was the first coup that failed, and so the Mossadegh started to arrest people, really started to crack down. He realized something was going on.
He started using a lot of his emergency powers, and
honestly, it gave the outside appearance of an autocratic
wannabe dictator, which is actually what the CIA used and the British for that matter, why it was okay to initiate what would become known as Operation Ajax.
Yeah, and even the Shah fled the country after the first attempt.
Oh, quick side note about Operation Ajax. The CIA operative in charge of Operation Ajax was a man named Kermit Roosevelt.
Kermit the Frog Roosevelt.
If that name sounds familiar,
yes, he is,
I believe, a direct descendant of Theodore Roosevelt.
Wasn't he the grandson?
Yeah, yep. He was Teddy Roosevelt's grandson.
And the funny thing is, after the first attempt, the CIA thought it failed now, and they called it off.
Yeah, they actually told Kermit Roosevelt to flee the country.
Yeah, so the Shah was not on board with the coup, and then he was. There's really no other way around it. He wasn't, and then he was.
Yeah, he basically was getting ready to flee, and he had just no will to actually fight for it. So he actually had fled, and then there was the second coup.
Yeah.
Now, the way parliamentary, especially constitutional monarchies work is that the prime minister rules by decree of
the monarch in charge. Technically, the
monarch can dismiss
their prime minister, which is kind of what the Shah does, and installs, or at least he appoints, a guy named Zahidi.
Yeah. It
Who
was his best general,
Yeah, it's his best general.
but he went into hiding after the first coup as well.
Yeah, which didn't work. The people weren't all that in favor of it.
Well, the thing is, though, like they called it off, but then as I read foreignpolicy.com about it, it said one person in the room told Kermit Roosevelt that there was no order from the CIA headquarters to cease and desist.
Now,
So
Eventually, Zahedi is named the prime minister. How do you pronounce the Communist Party's name?
again,
today,
The Tudeh. The Tudeh still stood in support
of
Mossadegh, and they organized rallies for it.
the CIA's plants, however, staged
Counter protests to this and created clashes that
you would need
somebody to come in and actually like get in control of. And this serves as further proof that Mossadegh no longer has
like control over.
the situation in Iran.
And so basically at this point, the justification that they're using, because they know they can't beat the National Front and Mossadegh and even the Tudeh, they can't beat them on the substance of what they've done. And so they really have to portray it as him being an autocrat who has lost control of his population.
and who was ready to align with the Soviet Union. I think that was one of the top tier important things as well.
Yeah, for the US especially.
Yeah, because since the proximity to the Soviet Union and Iran, they had that lingering desire, like this might be a communist country pretty soon, even though the Tudeh, in perspective, didn't have enough power to get a majority.
Yeah. So all this basically serves to embolden the Shah, who basically, through the help of the United States, is essentially promised more autocratic control
over the country.
And of course, the trade-off to that is that he needs to give favorable oil
Contracts to the U.S. and
Britain.
And you know what the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was renamed to? British
BP.
Petroleum.
BP. Yep.
BP.
Oh, everyone's best friend.
And then Mossadegh is arrested.
At his trial, he argues that the coup is, of course, illegal, which, quite honestly, it was. But
Yeah, very clearly, I mean, just the biggest bullshit there is.
And then he's on house arrest for what, 3 years?
yes.
Yeah, he's on house arrest for 3 years, and then he's confined to his home village after that for the rest of his life.
But the thing is, he dies in his apartment. They won't allow him to be moved to a proper burial site.
Yeah, because they know that if they did so, or they had a feeling that if they did so, there would be a big sort of nationalist spark that could be ignited, mourning his death and making a spectacle of it.
So, just to wrap this up, the Shah moves from a constitutional monarch to an authoritarian with the veneer of democracy, and it gets worse. Because of course it does, because again, the Shah's not interested
in
the material conditions of his people. He's conditioned he's
interested in keeping up the good contracts so that the
money keeps flowing for his British and American allies. And the Shah would remain in power as an autocratic ruler until the 70s.
1979, baby.
And the Islamic Revolution in Iran would happen and install the Ayatollah. That's a conversation for another day.
Although a real quick interesting note about that is in the lead up to that revolution, Mossadegh was kind of used as a symbol of what Iran had lost. But of course, because the religious extremists who ended up coming out on top after the 1979 revolution were not interested in democracy and the well-being of their people, he was used as a symbol during the revolution, and then afterward they kind of suppressed his image just the way the Shah had.
Yeah, the Ayatollah also did not like Mossadegh. He didn't like Mossadegh for a completely different reason. He felt like it was Mossadegh's job to move the country towards an Islamic state. Mossadegh,
in the grand tradition of a lot of leftist leaders,
especially post-World War II, were secular. Yeah, they were,
they had their own personal religions, but they didn't believe that religion should
guide the running of government.
Before the coup, this was the only time I think that Iran even had remote democracy.
Yeah, they haven't really since. The Ayatollah runs the country as a dictator. Yeah, there's a president of Iran, but
they're subservient to the Ayatollah.
And the U.S. government denied involvement in the coup, of course, for a while. And then in 2015, all the documents came out and the U.S. apologized for its role. But you know who hasn't apologized? The UK.
They never will. Just to really sum this up, this is an example of why the U.S. can't.
And no country should be meddling in other countries' democracies because
We end up creating our own worst enemies. Now, Iran's not really an enemy of the United States. They are in that they don't have like-minded international governments.
united belief system.
But Iran, they don't think about the U.S. on a day-to-day basis anyway.
Yeah, not
There's-
as much as the U.S. foreign policy establishment thinks about invading Iran.
And this is the U.S.'s first quote unquote win in the Cold War. They found that a coup could be successful.
Yeah, you're right. This will be their first of many coups. And actually, the one they do the very next year is in Guatemala, which will be my first choice of episode for the season that we'll be doing in a couple episodes. And so in 1954, they overthrow the democratically elected President Arbenz of Guatemala. Then, basically around the same time, that's also when the US hitches its wagon to Vietnam, taking that struggle over from the French.
It's all connected. This is part of the Mouthful of History cinematic universe.
Right? And then, of course, when the Cuban Revolution is victorious in 1959, they set their sights on Cuba as well, which will be another episode topic of mine this season.
Indonesia.
So basically, the Dulles brothers get a W, and they keep going for the W's, and in the process, create immense suffering and things that are all going to lead to immense blowback.
Yeah, we could have done an entire season just on the U.S.'s coups from post-World War II to, well, last year.
Hell, even an entire Dulles Brothers season, honestly.
So thank you for joining us on this ride.
Fuck the British.
Remember to fuck the British, as always. Fuck the U.S. government for sticking its nose where it doesn't fucking belong.
Especially the CIA.
Yes. Fuck the Dulles brothers.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew
Fuck
Jackson.
Andrew Jackson.
And remember to follow us on Twitter, on Facebook. Listen wherever you can and give us a review and like, subscribe. And, of course, as we mentioned last time, you can all support us on Patreon if you so choose. Give us some money, pay for Caroline so that we don't lose her to a podcast that actually pays money.
Yeah, just so y'all know, like, for a while, we, as in Cameron, Nick, and myself, are not actually going to be making any money off of this. We are paying Caroline because she deserves this, because she is the only one who actually works when it comes to this podcast, really. And then also the rest is just going to, like, maintenance and equipment and stuff for the podcast.
So if you love what we do, you can donate as little as $1. But obviously with Patreon, we have certain tiers that can give you access to certain content. So you can donate as low as $1 and donate to $5 and $8 as well.
$1, you get to listen to Nick rant about historical figures, not in any academic sense, just random thoughts that I have about people. The first one is already up. It's me just basically saying that the Romanovs deserve to get shot, and the only good thing they ever did for the country was dying.
Love it.
And so we also want to give a shout out to our patrons who have already donated. So we thank Lene, we thank Alex Millage, who is not my brother. We also like to thank Giovanni Franco, a longtime friend and fellow journalism colleague in the soccer world.
Thank you for all your support you've given us so far. And for anybody else, you will get the same shout out once you donate. All right. Thank you guys. Cameron, before we go, tell them what they're going to listen to next time.
So remember, for those who have listened to our final movie review of last season, we did the Battle of Algiers, which talked about part of the Algerian War of Independence. So building on what we already know, why not talk about it entirely?
Why not indeed?
Yes. Also, for those who we've already decided on our next review, we will be reviewing 1917, completing the trilogy of movies we asked you if you wanted us to review when we first started doing them.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure. Can't wait to talk to you next time. Peace out.
Thanks for listening,
Peace.
everyone.
Thank you, everybody.